Hello, folks. Welcome once again to another episode of the Images in Focus show. And with me, as always, is my good friend David. How are you doing, David?
I'm doing great. How are you doing, Juan?
I'm doing great. Looking forward to this episode. And folks, on this episode, we're going to be talking about depth of field. And depth of field is one of those things that, we use creatively in our photography, but I'm always surprised at how often it is misunderstood. So let's talk first about what is depth of field. So simply put, depth of field is how much of your image is acceptably in focus. And I say acceptably in focus is because, not the entire image is going to be in focus, even when you have a small aperture and you are shooting at a distant subject. And these are all factors that we're going to be talking about. And for me, depth of field is probably one of the most critical tools that I use in expressing my vision when I'm trying to capture an image. A depth of field allows us to control the narrative of an image. It also allows us to focus on a particular subject of that image. But we're going to talk about that a little more in a few more slides. Now, one thing that I want to warn people is that depth of field or focus does not equal sharpness. Sharpness is going to be a factor more of your lens, of how sharp your lens will be. Just because you have something in focus or you're using a small aperture, it doesn't mean that your subject is going to be sharp. Yes, if your image is out of focus, it's not going to be sharp. But you cannot necessarily improve the sharpness of your lens by changing the focus or the aperture. That's more or less fixed. So let's take a look at here how depth of field works. And you probably would have heard before that depth of field is when you focus on a subject, you have more depth of field behind the subject than you have in front of the subject. So like as I mentioned before, depth of field indicates how much of that subject is going to be in focus. The depth of field is going to tell you how much behind that critical point of focus is going to be in acceptable focus and much in front. And typically, to keep things nice and simple, you're going to have a depth of field that extends about a third of the scene in front of your subject and 2/3 behind the subject. So that, for example, when you're photographing, like in this illustration, an elk, you will have, and you focus on the eyes, you should have, if you have the appropriate depth of field, the snout of your elk will be in focus or acceptably in focus. Maybe the antlers as well as the shoulders may be in acceptably focus. But as you get closer to the end of that elk and the foliage and the trees behind, those areas are going to be a little bit out of focus. And that's a simple way of explaining how depth of field work. And David is going to give us probably a little bit more in-depth explanation of what that means.
So not to go too in-depth, but I want to quickly touch on the topic of circles of confusion. Now, you can only focus at one point within your image. And at that point, right where you focus, that's where everything is going to be pinpoint sharp, or as sharp as your lens can make it. Now, as we go in front of that point of best focus and behind that point of best focus, things are going to get a little bit soft. And what happens here is if you look at this diagram here on circles of confusion, right where we focus, right on that focal plane, that's pinpoint. But as we move in front of that, then we start getting things that are slightly out of focus. Not so much, but as we get further and further away from that plane of best focus, these circles of confusion get larger and larger. Eventually, they're going to reach a point where it looks to our eyes that it's blurry or out of focus. Now, where does that point lie? Well, it all depends on the situation. If you're going to be shooting a low resolution camera and it's only going to be seen on Instagram, well, yeah, you're going to have a large range of acceptable sharpness. If you're going to be doing a huge print and people are going to be viewing that close up, then you're going to have a much more narrow band of acceptable sharpness. And so these circles of confusion, these can actually be calculated. And you can figure out, based on what exactly you're shooting, how wide that band can be. But from all practical experience, it just depends what you're going to use that image for. If you're a pixel peeper and you're always zooming in to maximum resolution to see what's going on in your image, well, you're going to see that focus or that depth of field fall off much sooner than someone would that only views images, at lower resolutions. Now, Juan talked about this 1/3, 2/3 rule. That is a great way in practical terms to understand how depth of field works, especially for normal landscape style shooting. And yeah, when you're using like a wide angle to like a normal focal length lens, that does apply as long as you don't have anything that's super close to your lens. Now, once you start getting a subject that is very, very close to your lens, then that changes. Now we're going to suddenly enter a regime that I call the 50-50 rule, where now 50% of our depth of field lies in front of where we focused and 50% lies behind where we focus. So if I'm shooting a landscape and, my nearest foreground element is maybe 3 or 4 feet away, yeah, I'm going to be in that normal regime of 1/3, 2/3. But if I'm shooting and I have a foreground element that's like a foot or closer to my lens, now that's changing. Now I'm starting to push into that 50-50 range. I'm not going to be able to have the same hyperfocal or depth of field advantage that I would have if the subject was placed further away. The other thing I want to bring up is that when you're shooting with telephoto lenses, that also changes us to the 50-50 regime. Now we only have 50% in front, 50% behind. And that would apply, if I'm shooting something like with my 100 to 400 millimeter lens, for example. And we're going to show you some examples of that later on in this presentation. So how important is depth of field? Well, as Juan already talked about, it's hugely important. It's one of the main compositional tools that we are going to have. It's a way that we can either simplify our scene by blurring out that background or by allowing the viewer to see the whole three-dimensional effect of that grand landscape and having everything perfectly sharp from foreground all the way into background. That's something that you, as the photographer, need to decide, and you have to tell that narrative. You have to tell that story. And it really will affect, how the viewer is going to interpret that image.
So let's talk a little bit about, what shallow depth of field does. Because when we talk about depth of field, we can look at two different types of depth of field, a shallow depth of field or a deep depth of field. So what does a shallow depth of field does for us? And again, as David said, is controlling the depth of field is probably the most powerful tool that we have in order to tell a story with our images. So a shallow depth of field allows us to focus our viewer's attention, allows us to have the viewer of the image that you're presenting or you have printed to pay attention to what you want them to pay attention to and give the main subject or highlight the main subject of your scene, which is also basically, in other words, narrowing the image narrative. Is basically steering your viewer towards what you want them to see and towards a specific narrative of that image. And very important as well, and what I love most about using a shallow depth of field is that it can provide depth and dimension to your images. So it can make those subjects pop out, look three-dimensional on your screen, and kind of jump out at you. While still providing, if you use that shallow depth of field it still allows you to put them in their element and in their place and in their environment to help with that narrative. Let's take a look at a couple of examples here. This first image is a macro shot of a gladiator frog in Costa Rica. And, pretty shallow depth of field. I'm shooting macro here. I'm shooting at 100 millimeters. And you can see that my f-stop is 5.6. And that was pretty deliberate. A macro lens like this can go down to an f2.8. which will give me a much shallower depth of field than the 5.6. But I wanted to find a spot that allowed enough of my subject to be in focus, as well as enough of the environment around my subject to be in focus, but all those other elements that are, outside of the eyes or behind or in front of the eyes, kind of have it fall off beautifully out of focus. And that's what f5.6 allows me to do here, controlling that depth of field. Let's look at another example here real quick. And this is at f2.8. I'm not as close to my subject. I'm a little further back. But my depth of field is actually here pretty razor thin. If you look at my butterfly, my moth, I am, perfectly parallel to that moth in order to have it all in focus. If you were able to zoom in on this image and you looked at the tips of of those tails, you will see that those are starting to fall off. From being tack sharp. Same thing with the fern behind it. Again, like David said, one of the things that happens when you look at images kind of smaller in the frame, that circle of confusion or that area of acceptable focus kind of expands a little bit. So more of the image seems to be in focus. But if you were to blow this up, you could see that those background elements start falling off. But then one of the things that it does, as you can see here, is that distant background is completely creamy and out of focus, providing that sense of depth and dimension to the image and making that moth look like it's about to jump off the screen and onto your lap, if you will, because it does give you that sense of depth, brings it out, give it that three-dimensionality that we all strive for.
So deep depth of field is kind of the other side of the coin. It really places your subject in the environment in which they're in. So if I was shooting wildlife, I would want the elk and I'd want the mountain that I have behind the elk to both be sharp, or at least the mountain to be acceptably sharp and not completely blurred out. And it provides that context that can be so important. If I'm shooting a landscape and I have like beautiful wildflowers in front, well, I want those wildflowers to be sharp. I also want my distant landscape features to also be sharp, especially if I'm going to print this and put it on the wall. And, it can also create that feeling of isolation. Let's go over an example here. This is a shot that Juan took over at Reflection Lake in Mount Rainier. We want these foreground flowers to be sharp. We also want the reflection to be sharp, and we want the mountain in the background to be sharp. So to do that, he utilized techniques that would allow him to achieve deep depth of field. And as you can see up here, he shot this at f16, which allowed him to do that in a single shot. Now, what affects depth of field? Well, we most associate depth of field with the aperture that we shoot on our lens, whether we're shooting f4, f2.8, or f16. That is definitely one of the primary variables. But there's three other variables that we're going to discuss that also have a lot of bearing on the depth of field. And it's very important that we consider all four factors, not just the aperture factor. So what are the four factors? Well, number one, aperture. Number two, the focal length that we choose to shoot. Number three, the distance from the focal point, or the distance from our subject. And four, the sensor size of the camera that we are shooting with. So with aperture, the smaller the aperture, in other words, the smaller we stop that lens down, the deeper the depth of field becomes. And so if we're shooting like at f16, where the lens is stopped down to a really small pinhole where just a little bit of light's coming in, we're going to have a much deeper depth of field than if the lens is wide open and we're shooting it at f4 or f2.8. And this is one of the most understood and most familiar ways to control depth of field in our imagery. But one thing we do have to bear in mind when we're talking about aperture is that as we really stop that lens down, pretty soon diffraction becomes limiting. And diffraction occurs when light bends around like a small opening or a sharp corner. And so when those aperture blades really constrict in, now all of a sudden it's diffracting the light. And that light diffraction causes a softening of the image. So even though we may gain depth of field by stopping down really small, we're going to start losing softness due to diffraction. So it's kind of a trade-off. And you have to decide, well, what's going to be a bigger impact in my image? Is it going to be the diffraction softening, or is it going to be the depth of field loss? And that's something that only you can answer, because it's going to depend on the type of camera you're using, the quality of the lens, and the type of landscape or wildlife situation that you are shooting. So when I was up in Alaska, I found these cool mushrooms out in the forest. And I decided, you know what, this is a good example to show exactly what happens as we change aperture. And so I shot this first image up here at f2.8. And you can see that at f2.8, only the front spores of the mushroom are really in focus. You know, we start getting out of focus as we go out towards the back part of the mushroom. At f4, we're starting to see a little bit more of the mushroom in focus, but still the back part of the mushroom is still out of focus. But you can see in this f2.8 shot that it really simplifies this messy background. You know, you're kind of getting that creamy look that Juan was talking about. At f4, we're starting to see more of the distracting background come into focus. Starting to see some outlines of sticks and other things that are kind of unsightly. At f10 now we're starting to see a lot more of the mushroom in focus, the more of the background's coming through. And finally at f18, now we're starting to really see a lot more into that background. So this is just a quick visual example showing how, you know, the aperture definitely will control a lot of the depth of field as you shoot. Here's another kind of a landscape example. No, normally with landscapes, we're always thinking we want deep depth of field. We want to see everything in focus from foreground all the way to background. But that's not necessarily the case. You know, many of my more creative shots will utilize like a shallower depth of field because it will bring into sharper focus the things I care about. In this case, my main subject was this lace rock. And I wanted that lace rock to be really sharp. And I shot this at f4 because what it did was it kind of added in a way, a kind of a vignette. It's so soft back here that the eye doesn't focus on this background detail. Instead, it forces my eye to focus right in on this nice lace rock. Now, when I shoot this at f13, it's a completely different feel, a completely different image. Now, these background lines are sharp, and you know, it kind of takes away from the impact that this lace rock has in my foreground. So I'll show you that again. This is f4, and it kind of adds that natural soft vignette, really makes the rock stand out. At f13 now, it kind of just blends in more with everything that's going on behind it. Here's an example that Juan took of another landscape. And you can see here we have great detail all the way from the foreground into the distant mountains. And again, we achieved that by shooting at f14.
So let's talk about the second aspect. As David just mentioned, you know, aperture is probably the most well-known and the one that we use the most. But focal length also plays a huge factor on your depth of field. And it's something that not a lot of people consider or think about when they're shooting. And this is one of the reasons why lens selection, or at least focal length selection, makes a huge difference in your image composition. And by the way, this applies on a fixed prime lens as well as a zoom lens. Your depth of field is going to change as you zoom in or out using a zoom lens. So the rule here is that the longer the focal length, the shallower the depth of field. So the longer the focal length, meaning like a 500 millimeters or 400 millimeters versus a 24 millimeters, the longer the focal length is going to give you shallower depth of field. The shorter the focal length, the deeper the depth of field. So that's why oftentimes in a lot of those landscape images, we want to be shooting with a shorter lens if we want to extend that depth of field as much as possible. So let's take a quick look here at one example of the depth of field with a long focal length. So this image of a wimbrel I photographed at 500 millimeters using a big long lens, and I was laying down or sitting down on the sand, and I wanted to have an acceptable level of depth of field in order to get my entire wimbrel in focus. These birds are kind of big. They're about, I want to say 18 to 20 inches high, and their beaks are very, very long. So there's a lot of depth here between the tail and the beak. And even at f8, and you can actually see the depth of field nice and clear if you look down on the sand right by the feet of the wimbrel. The depth of field is actually really, really narrow. It's just enough to keep most of the bird in focus. As a matter of fact, again, if you zoom in on the tip of that tail or the tip of that beak, you will see that those two areas are just slightly out of focus, because even at f8, that 500 millimeter lens is giving you a very shallow depth of field. And this is crucial to consider in conjunction with the next variable in depth of field. So that other variable is going to be our distance from our subject. That's something, again, very important to consider, especially when you're using a long focal length, but also when you're shooting a shorter focal length as well. So the further you are away from your subject, the deeper the depth of field. So as you move away from the subject, your depth of field is going to grow. However, the closer you are to your focal point or to your subject, the shallower the depth of field. And this is the major reason why macro has such a shallow depth of field. Because oftentimes when we're shooting macro, we're very, very close, right? We're like kind of inches in a lot of ways away from our subject. So it's something to consider. That's one of the reasons why we need to understand all these different factors and how they apply in our depth of field. So let's take a quick look at a couple of examples here. So this image is a pronghorn in Yellowstone in the winter. And even though, as we talked about earlier, I'm shooting with a 500 millimeter lens, which is giving me a shallow depth of field, I'm shooting this at about 200 feet away. So that 200 feet away is making up for the shallowness of that long focal length, if you will. So even though I'm shooting at f5.6 and I'm shooting at 500, remember the previous image that I showed you of that wimbrel, I was shooting at f8 and my depth of field was really shallow, but that's because that subject was very close. In this case, the subject being further away at 200 feet, my depth of field grew enough that I could have my entire pronghorn here in focus. You know, I have the face, the eyes in focus, which is the most critical part of the animal to have in focus, as well as the rear end of the pronghorn, which is one of the things I wanted to capture in this image because of their unique behavior that they exhibit when they get a little spooked. The hair stand up on edge. And you can see also by looking at the ground how deep my depth of field is. My depth of field here is measured in feet. Versus with wimbrel, we were measuring it in inches, even though I'm using the same lens. And I have a wider aperture. Smaller numbered aperture, but a wider aperture. Now, the depth of field has grown dramatically because the distance has also grown. Let's look at another example here. And this is your image, so why don't you talk about this and what it was like when you were shooting this image?
So for this image, I was very close to my subject. In fact, I was probably right around the minimum focusing distance for the lens I was using, which was a 500 millimeter. And I shot this at f4, and you can see just how shallow this depth of field is. Look at all this grass all around this goose. You don't really see any blades of this grass being sharp because the only plane that's actually in focus is the goose's head. And there's even a piece of grass right here in front of its neck. You don't even see it because it's so out of focus. And this is I knew that by getting up really close like this and shooting at that minimum focusing distance, that it was really going to give me that super shallow depth of field, which is what made this image come alive for me compositionally. If I was seeing all these blades of grass and everything else, and they were actually sharp, then it would lose its appeal because now it becomes messy and it's not the composition I was after.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great thing about shallow depth of field. It kind of cleans your images up a lot and makes messy backgrounds much clearer. Okay, so let's look at another example here of using a long lens. This is a 500 millimeter lens with a teleconverter, so I'm close to 700 millimeters here. And, you know, these animals are really far away, and this is why I'm using, even though they're pretty large animals, musk oxen, you know, I'm shooting at 700 millimeters, but the only reason I can keep them in my frame is because I am so far away. I literally was about 300 feet away from these guys, and because of that, even though I'm shooting at f5.6, which is the, you know, a maximum aperture, minimum aperture, or, you know, greatest aperture that I can shoot this with this combination at, everything in the foreground, all those rocks, if you look down at the ground, it's you know, in focus, it's sharp. And that's, again, because of that distance that I am from my subject. So here, I'm shooting at f5.6, which is going to give me, you know, a relatively narrow depth of field. I'm shooting at 700 millimeters, which is also going to give me a relatively narrow depth of field. But what is overcoming those two factors is my distance away from my subject. I'm 300 feet away, so which is quite far, which then allows that depth of field to grow and expand to the extent that the entire scene ends up being in focus.
So the final element that controls the depth of field is the size of your sensor in your camera or your smartphone or whatever it is you might be shooting. Now, this is going to be an oversimplification, but the smaller the sensor, the greater the depth of field. And just think of like your cell phone. You can go with your cell phone and get up really close to something and take a picture, and everything looks like it's in focus. You know, from whatever it was that was super close to the phone all the way into the background. You know, I see a lot of people like to use their cell phones as kind of tools to kind of find compositions when they're out in a landscape or something. And they'll get down really close to something and be like, oh, this looks so good. And then they'll go set up their real camera and they can't replicate the same shot. The reason is when you have that larger sensor, it's going to be much harder to, or you basically are not going to be able to get the same amount of depth of field. Here's just a quick chart showing a bunch of different sensor sizes. This up here is the medium format, which is the largest digital sensor that we have. Then we have the full frame sensor over here, which is very common. That's the 35 millimeter equivalent of digital. And then we have the crop sensor sizes, which are like 60% or 50 to 60% smaller. And those are very popular with like prosumer cameras. You know, oftentimes people's first camera tends to be a crop sensor camera. But then we have these other smaller formats like micro four thirds and cell phone sensors, which are kind of these small little guys down here. And with those, you can achieve crazy depth of field. You know, when I shot macro, I could shoot macro so much easier with my crop sensor camera because I had so much more depth of field to work with. When I try to shoot macro now with a full frame, it's 10 times more difficult. I have to focus stack like crazy to get everything to be acceptably sharp. And so how do the four factors all come into play? Well, you have to take all four into consideration because obviously aperture matters. But if you're shooting a long focal length and you have a subject that's really close to you, there's no way you can get everything to be acceptably sharp because now you're just way too close to your subject and you're using too long of a focal length. Now, of course, the sensor size, that's something that's going to be pretty much fixed depending on which camera you decide to pull out. But if you have like a crop sensor versus a full frame camera, you may decide, okay, I'm going to use the crop sensor because I'm going to do a macro shot and I need more depth of field to work with. So the purpose of this video is to give you a good primer on what these four variables are so that when you're in a particular shooting scenario, you can consider the effect each one has and determine how you want to adjust your shooting.
So how do these four factors come into play? To reiterate what David was saying, is for different types of shootings, you need to consider all these different factors. Now, what's important is that once you have found your perspective to your subject, meaning you have come up to the distance from your subject, and you have selected your lens, which means your focal length, because you can't really change in most cases, you can't change the crop sensor of your lens. Now you're going to control the depth of field with aperture. Very important to keep that in mind. Not always the depth of field is going to give you the exact depth. Not changing the aperture is not going to always give you the same depth of field because you have all these other variables to think about. Let's take a look at a couple of examples here. Okay, so here is a wildlife scenario that we can discuss a little bit. So this was a ground squirrel that I photographed in Glacier National Park, and these guys are really used to people. So I was able to, be very close to this guy because it was right off the main trail. And I had a wide angle lens. I was shooting a 24-105, but I still wanted to capture this little ground squirrel in a little bit of its environment, and I wanted to keep some of that environment in focus, but not too much in focus in order for it to be distracting. So I chose a 5.6 aperture, which is actually the maximum aperture that you can have on this lens at 105 millimeters. Actually, no, that's not true. This lens can go to f4. So I did close it down to 5.6 in order to get a little bit depth of field, make sure that my ground squirrel was completely in focus. I had some of those lilies in the foreground also in focus, but that my background, even though there was a hint of the environment, wasn't overpowering, and I could really just focus on my subject. Now let's look at another wildlife example here. And this is a burrowing owl. This was taken in the Dominican Republic. And, I was, quite a bit away from these guys. They're kind of skittish. You can't get, at least in this location, you can't get all that close. So I'm shooting with a long lens, a 500 with a teleconverter installed, and I'm about 100 feet away. So I'm shooting at f5.6 because that's the maximum aperture that I have to shoot with at that particular situation with that lens and that teleconverter, because I wanted to make sure that background was completely out of focus. That background was a little bit distance behind the subject. Now, I'm going to give you a little tip here, which I think it's important. If you want to get those backgrounds nicely out of focus, one of the best ways to assure that those backgrounds are really out of focus is for there to be twice the distance from your subject as you are from your subject. So in this case, for example, I'm 100 feet away or approximately 100 feet away from my subject. I want that background to be about 200 feet away from the subject or 300 feet away from me. And that's going to assure that background gets really nice and creamy like this, even though my subject is 100 feet away, meaning that I will have quite a bit of depth of field, even though I'm shooting at f5.6. And as you can see, by going through those thought processes and figuring out your distance, your focal length, you can then compose an image that makes your subjects really stand out. If that background had been in focus, my subject would have been kind of like diminished because it wouldn't stand out. You wouldn't have that depth and dimension in the scene. So David, let's look at a landscape scenario. Why don't you walk us through this one?
Yeah, so with landscape shooting, we have the normal mode that we already talked about, where you have 1/3 of the depth of field that lies in front, 2/3 that lies behind. And that will typically happen with almost anything you shoot where, your main foreground subject is at least 2 to 3 feet from your lens. This is the case here with this old truck out in this field. I shot this at f9 because that's a very sharp aperture for the lens I was shooting, and I was at 24 millimeters. This truck, it's several feet away from me, and by focusing here, I have depth of field that gives the foreground grass sharpness, but then it's also sharp all the way into these distant hills. Now, if I change up and I go to a longer focal length, I can still get everything in focus or acceptably sharp, as long as everything is far away from my lens. In this case, my buddy, he was standing on this cliff over here. He was a long way away from me. And so was this glacier. It was also a long way away from me. And because they were both far away, I could get both him and the glacial ice to be nice and sharp at 200 millimeters, shooting at f13. All right, for my third example, I'm going to show this scene of these glacier lilies. Now, these are really tiny flowers. And in order for them to come out in my shot, I had to get very low and very close. Now, it was a difficult shot to pull off because there was some slight breezes coming in. But I got one period where it was calm enough that everything just kind of stood still. So what I did is I focus stacked. In other words, I focused on the nearest foreground element, and then I incrementally moved that focus further and further back until I got towards my infinity focus. And then I used post-processing techniques to be able to combine all those together and get a perfectly sharp image, foreground to background. Now, these closest flowers here, they were only inches from my lens. We're talking like 5 or 6 inches away. At that point now, we don't have that 1/3 to 2/3 advantage anymore. There's no way I can choose a hyperfocal distance that will get everything in sharp, or everything sharp in this image from foreground to background, even if I shot it at f22. So in this kind of case, now that I've moved into that 50-50 regime that I talked about earlier, the only way I can get a sharp image is to focus stack. Now let's say that the wind never calmed down and I wasn't able to get close like this. In that case, I would have to go up and shoot higher. I'd have to go higher, make sure that the nearest flower is at least a foot away from my lens, maybe even just a little bit further away than that. Then I would focus 1/3 of the way distance-wise into the scene, and I'd probably shoot this at f16. That would probably give me an image then that would be sharp from foreground all the way to background. So just depending on the variables that you have at the time that you're shooting, you're going to have to make these kind of adjustments real time. And for the final example here, this is a longer lens scenario, 200 millimeters. But now I'm trying to compress a relatively close foreground with a background. And when that happens, I rapidly lose my depth of field. And you can see this dotted line right here. This is where I chose to focus. And this is at f10, 200 millimeter. And my depth of field is pretty narrow. It only extends up about right here and extends down below to about here. Anything outside those boundaries gets noticeably blurry. There would be no way for me to be able to do this type of landscape compression and get everything sharp from foreground to background, even at the smallest possible aperture. The only way I could do it is I would have to focus stack it. And with telephoto lenses, focus stacking becomes even more difficult because things tend to move around. So just, you need to take these kind of considerations into play, when you're out there shooting. How close is your foreground to you? How long of a lens are you using? How much compression are you trying to achieve? And that will tell you if you can get everything acceptably sharp or not.
So let's look at a couple macro scenarios. And the first one that we're going to be looking at is this little mushroom. And you can see how shallow the depth of field is because I am 6 inches away from my subject. Yes, I'm shooting at 100 millimeters, which is not necessarily a very long focal length. And I'm shooting at f8, but yet my depth of field is super shallow, and that's because I am so close. In this case, this works very well for me. I shot at f8 because I wanted enough depth of field to be able to see all those ridges at the bottom of the mushroom, but I also wanted that background and that near foreground to kind of melt away and get a little blurry to focus my viewer's attention onto that mushroom. Things that are super important when you're trying to compose an image like this for macro and draw your viewer's attention to what you consider to be the most important part of your image. Now, if we look at a second scenario here, we have a macro of a green tree frog. And again, I am just 6 inches away from this frog, so I know my depth of field is going to be very, very shallow. I'm shooting at 100 millimeters. Again, I'm very close to my subject, and I kept my aperture somewhat, wide because I wanted that shallow depth of field to focus my viewer's attention on the eye of the frog so they can notice the intricate, beautiful patterns on the eye. You can see, if you look closely, that the eye is nicely sharp and focused, but even as you get closer to the front of the frog and you look at those nostrils, they're going to be a tiny bit out of focus, and it's because that depth of field is so shallow. And that's what f5.6 would have done for me. If I had shot this at f2.8, I would guess that not even the entire eye would be in focus. Only that part of the eye that I focused on would be in focus, and the rest will be somewhat out of focus. So choosing that aperture, incredibly important for this kind of image. Let's look at the last example here, and that is this gray tree frog. And again, I'm shooting here with another macro lens, but in this case, it's a 180 macro, which gives me a shallower depth of field, given the same distance compared to a 100, because it's a longer focal length lens. Now, one of the things that a longer macro gives you is more working distance from your subject, so you don't have to get up close to get them to fill the frame. But even here in this case, because I wanted to keep my entire frog in focus, I wanted to keep it within the depth of field to show its camouflage pattern against the tree that it's on. I needed to use a smaller aperture, and I needed to back up away from my subject in order to increase that depth of field. Again, because I'm using that 180, I have a shallower depth of field, and I'm compensating by using a smaller aperture, f16, and I'm backing up from my subject. And this is what I need to do in order to manage that depth of field. And this is how you can see that you can use these different tools that you're given in order to increase that depth of field. You don't have to be stuck with the depth of field that a particular aperture gives you. You know that you have other tools in order to increase that depth of field.
So in summary, in order to achieve deep depth of field, we need 4 things. We need to use a shorter focal length. We need a larger distance from our subject. We need a small aperture, in other words, large f-stop number like f11, f14, f16, kind of in that range. And if we can, we should use a smaller format sensor. People who shoot like the large format film, they often have to be stopped down clear to like f64 in order to get everything sharp. Whereas with a cell phone type camera or like my drone camera or something like that, I can get everything pretty sharp at like f2.8 or f3.5. For shallow depth of field, it's just the opposite. In that case, we want to use the longer focal lengths. That's why, when I did some portrait work, I would love like that 70 to 200 millimeter lens, because, I could really get that nice creamy background to fall out of focus and everything like that with that longer focal length. You also want to have a shorter distance from your subject. Get up nice and close to that subject if you really want that shallow depth of field. You want the large apertures, the f4s, the f2.8s, the f1.4, whatever your lens can do. And then, of course, you can use a larger format sensor like the full frame cameras, the medium format cameras. They're going to also help you, with that shallow depth of field. So we really hope that this video helped you understand, the intricacies behind depth of field. Obviously, this is a simple explanation. But, these 4 factors that we mentioned, they come into play with everything that you shoot. And with this understanding, we hope that this will help you have more creative control over your depth of field and allow you to produce higher quality images. So again, thanks for tuning into the episode, folks. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure you give us a thumbs up, give us a comment in the comment section below, and make sure you engage with us on our Facebook group, Images in Focus. And until next time, we will see you again soon.
Take care, folks.